My name's Belinda Osier. I'm on the board. I'm the secretary of the society. Bobby Ives could not be here tonight. Usually he introduces our speakers, but I'm taking his place tonight. First of all, I want to welcome you all here tonight. It's a wonderful crowd. I'm sorry it is so hot. I won't keep you at all. I just have a couple of announcements before I introduce our wonderful speaker. First of all, you may have seen the big yellow ducks all over town. We are having a ducky race on August 13th. You should buy your tickets as soon as you can. They are limited in number. So 1,000 tickets, get your tickets now. They're available at the Old Bristol History Center and at other places around town. Also, next Sunday, we are having an ice cream social at our property in Pemaquid Falls. This is not a fundraiser. It is just a way for us to thank our volunteers and our members and all our supporters. So come on by. You can view the exhibits. It will be open even though it's a Sunday, and there'll be some guided tours of the museum and of course some delicious ice cream. That is being held from 2 to 4 next Sunday afternoon. And finally, this is our, our third talk, I think, our third talk of the season. We have 2 more talks this season. The next one will be 2 weeks from tonight. It will be held here, but probably not in the sanctuary, probably in the other room. As you know, our speaker tonight was very popular last year, which is why we moved into the sanctuary for this year. But 2 weeks from tonight, it will probably be in the other room, and it will be, I will be presenting slides of Marion, taken by photographer Marion Brackett, featuring images of New Harbor, its wharves, its fishermen, its boats during the 1960s and 70s. So it will be a real trip down memory lane for those who knew people during that time, but it will also be a very interesting look at that period in the fishing community of New Harbor. So we hope you'll join us again. Okay, right on to our speaker. We don't want to dilly-dally tonight. Emerson Tad Baker is a professor of history at Salem State University and has previously served as vice provost and dean of the Salem State Graduate School. He was born in Fitchburg, Mass. He attended Phillips Andover Academy and Bates College, graduating with a BA in history in 1980, the same year I graduated from Bates. He then studied for a period in England and went on to the University of Maine, where he received an MA in history and historical archaeology, and eventually did a PhD in history from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Tad joined the faculty of Salem State College in 1994 and is a specialist in the history of 17th century Maine. He is the award-winning author or co-author of 6 books on the history and archaeology of early New England, including A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience, and The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. Tad has served as a consultant and on-camera expert for historical documentaries and TV shows for networks ranging from PBS to TLC to Smithsonian and the History Channel. So we're very lucky to have Tad here tonight. And I just want to add one more thing. He also dug and did surveys at Colonial Pemaquid back in the 1980s. So Tad is very familiar with this area, and I know he's very fond of it as well. So please join me in welcoming.
Thanks, Belinda. It is always a treat. Every summer I like to get back down here. My first job out of college was working at Pemaquid Excavating William Henry with Chuck Rand and a few other folks, and it's one of my favorite places on earth. Not to mention the fact my wife and I honeymooned there. And she usually comes with me, but she's babysitting our aged basset hound who doesn't travel all that great these days. Oh, she's in fine health. She's just real ornery. That is the dog, not my wife. Anyhow, So when people wanted me to come back and talk about the witch trials again, I said, well, I can't really give the same talk. So how about if I kind of pick up where I left off last time and talk about the aftermath? Because actually in my book, the last couple chapters of my book are about events after 1692. And honestly, right now, I've started to work on a sequel to that book, which is really going to be on the topic of trauma and loss and the gradual healing process that took place in Salem from the witch trials to today. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. This is actually like the first time I've given this talk, though I've talked about pieces of it from time to time, but this is kind of give you an idea of where that new book is going to go. My book, Storm of Witchcraft, was in the Pivotal Moments in American History series from Oxford University Press. And I really do feel that the witch trials were this pivotal moment, that really sort of an end of an era, the beginnings of the end of Puritan New England, really and frankly, in some ways, maybe the beginnings of American distrust in government. I mean, I think no matter where you lie on the political spectrum, we have this instinctive, almost knee-jerk reaction against the government. I mean, the simple fact is, if I say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, pretty much everybody's going to laugh at that, right? Because no one really believes, right? Well, the problem is, of course, in 1692, we had the first mass failure of a colonial government to protect the innocent when they let 25 innocent people die and well over another 100 to be locked up in jail, sometimes for over a year. And to make matters worse, of course, in the fall of 1692, Governor Phipps initiates a cover-up where he issues a ban on publications, and that lasts for several years. Well, I'll talk a bit about that. Well, despite those efforts, people really refused to forget about the witch trials, even as many of them left Salem. We'll talk about the Salem diaspora tonight. And frankly, we'll talk about the healing that really takes generations to take on. You know, when I started writing on the witch trials, well, I guess I really started doing that about 25, 30 years ago when I co-authored a biography on Sir William Phipps, and I had no idea really where it would take me. And even then when I wrote the book on the Salem witch trials, I thought I was writing a history book, but every time I teach the course, and I'm teaching my graduate seminar again this fall, or when I give a talk like this, I feel that in some ways I'm acting almost as much as a social worker as a historian. Because the story to me has tremendous relevance. It's about social justice. It's about scapegoating and what happens when you scapegoat people over some sort of difference. I think we're all different in some way. But when you happen to choose someone to scapegoat, to blame for problems that are probably largely of your own making. And that's what happened in Salem. And frankly, it took hundreds of years for people to get over that. And in some ways, Salem is still recovering from that long, dark shadow cast by Gallows Hill. So that's what I really want to talk about tonight. Now, for those of you who missed part one, well, first of all, I said, there are copies of my book here for sale. But what happened? Well, in brief, and again, frankly, I could talk just about this whole book. Well, again, let's put it this way. I teach like a 16-week graduate seminar that's largely on this book and other things. So we could be here a long time, and it's a little too hot for that. But let's just say, I call it a storm of witchcraft to compare it to that other great perfect storm, which of course was another Essex County disaster as well that wiped out the fishing fleet. Because the fact is, though, it really takes a perfect storm to create such a horrible outbreak of witchcraft, which was far and away the largest outbreak of witchcraft in American history. You know, there were close to 100 people accused of witchcraft throughout the English colonies before 1692, and a number had been executed. So this was nothing new. Nor was it the last accusation. And in fact, in the 18th century, there were hundreds of people still executed in Europe for witchcraft. So it's not the last either. But usually in America, in New England, you'd have one or maybe two people arrested and tried for witchcraft. And it was usually kind of round up the usual suspects. Again, those people who don't conform. First person accused, Tituba, the Native American enslaved woman owned by Reverend Paris, right? Sarah Good, the distempered beggar woman, right? Or Sarah Osborne, who scandalized Salem Village by freeing and then marrying her indentured servant. Wow, pretty racy stuff. Those are the kinds of things that got you accused of witchcraft. And in 1692, if it had been like another case of witchcraft, those people would have been accused, something might have happened, might not have, and would have all blown over. But of course, there were things going wrong in Salem to create these conditions, to create this perfect storm. We're talking about colony-wide political instability, waiting the arrival of new Governor Phipps, who arrives in May 1692 with a new charter, a new form of government. And you pile that on top of factionalism and political uncertainty and religious division in Salem Village, where many people don't like Reverend Parris and his fire and brimstone sermons. And this takes place amid the background of perceived decline in Puritanism. Now, a lot of 17th century historians talk about this idea of Puritan declension, Puritan decline, and to the fact that the Puritans, by the second half of the 17th century, feel that they have kind of dropped from their ideal of when they founded Massachusetts Bay and created that city upon a hill, right? As John Winthrop refers to in that famous quote that, again, American politicians use all the time these days, and frankly have for several hundred years, that somehow Puritan Massachusetts had strayed from its spiritual mission. And you know, the fact is that so many people were so upset about this probably tells you it was still a pretty devout place. And it was really more perceived decline than anything else. But there was still enough to get a lot of people worried that Satan had been let into their midst as a test for the people of Massachusetts. Because after all, Satan is created by God and is let loose by God as a test for mankind. So this is what people felt they were up against 1692. And being good Puritans in the age before science, they believed everything in the world was a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure. Comets, hailstorms, thunderstorms, lightning strikes, God's anger. Bumper crops, rainbows, successful birth of children, God's blessing. So when you have all these sorts of political troubles and spiritual troubles combined with the worst weather in anyone's memory, and we now know it was the 1690s was the worst weather of the Little Ice Age. You have these horrible killer frosts late into the spring, into May, into June. Long, dry, hot summers. Hello? Well, I guess ours isn't dry this year, is it? No. It is today. Killer frosts in like August and September. Crop failure, starvation, hunger, inflation, bad economic times, and also military disaster because Massachusetts is losing a war on the frontier in 1692. And the war they're just not losing militarily. And yes, that is the war when Pemaquid in 1689 is attacked and destroyed for the second time. But also, it is a spiritual war because the war they are losing too is to the French Catholics of Acadia and New France, and their allies, the pagan, or perhaps adopted Catholicism, Native Americans, the Wabanaki. So it would seem that, frankly, the people the Puritans saw as minions of the Pope, agents of Satan, pardon me. Puritans had crazy views. I won't even talk about how they felt about Quakers, but they had some real problems with Quakers, too. They actually executed a few of them. They were so upset with them. Just for believing that everyone were equal, including women, and that women and everybody should be allowed to get up and speak in church. Pretty threatening, huh? Well, anyhow. This was seen as the ultimate sign of New England was losing this war to these forces that were going to destroy Puritan New England. And frankly, they came pretty close to doing it, right? Pretty much every settlement north of the Saco River was abandoned. And at some point, towards the end of the war, Governor Bellamont writes home to his wife in England, and he basically says, you know, if the Native Americans around here get their act in gear and all work together, I may be taking a boat home soon, along with everyone else here. It was that dire a situation, really. Never really came to pass, but I like to talk about that because we love to talk about this idea of, you know, America from sea to shining sea and manifest destiny. And once they stepped on that rock in Plymouth in 1620, which they probably didn't actually do, but once they supposedly did, it was just upward from there, right? Not so. One thing it was not, ergot poisoning. Nothing to do with ergot poisoning. And the brief answer to the question you're bound to ask about that is, well, Ergot poisoning is this idea that they were basically having eating moldy grain which had ergot on it, which is naturally forming LSD, and that the afflicted girls were just having a bad trip. Well, the fact that this idea was first published around 1970 in sort of the drug-induced Timothy Leary days might tell you something. The other problem is that there are a couple different types of ergot, and the one that also gives the hallucinations also is like a dry rot ergot that causes gangrene, your limbs shrivel, blacken, fall off, you die. No one mentions anything like this, and in fact, most of the afflicted girls seem to do quite well. So I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on television, but it doesn't make sense, right? Other thing is, too, think about it, is why was it that only like 1 or 2 members of the family became afflicted? If everyone is eating the same moldy bread, they all should be tripping. Yeah, no, doesn't work. Anyhow, but I'm not really here to talk about that today, although I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end or stick around and chat to people about that. What I really want to do is sort of use as a launching point for my talk tonight is the one fact that I think to me is perhaps the most horrible fact about the Salem witch trials that few people realize, and that is, in 1692, only those who refused to confess to the capital crime of witchcraft, for which the punishment was death, in theory, only those who refused to confess to this capital crime died in 1692. All of those 55 people, over a third of the people accused, confessed to being witches. Now, as recently as 4 years before, a woman had confessed to witchcraft in Boston in 1688, and she was, first off, they brought a bunch of doctors into her to talk to her to make sure that she was of sound mind. Because if you're of sound mind, well, that's one thing. But if you're not of sound mind, I mean, and why would you confess to witchcraft if you're of sound mind? But if you're not of sound mind, then of course we're not going to execute you because you clearly have challenges. Of course, after she confessed and after they interviewed her, they decided she was of sound mind and they executed her. So I like to kid my wife of Irish heritage. I said her real problem was Goody Glover was Irish. And I mean that in that she actually probably was Irish Catholic and didn't speak English. So I think when the ministers interviewed her, she probably suffered from a real bad translator. And particularly when you start talking about Catholic religion, it's like, well, do you worship anything besides God? Well, I venerate the saints. Ooh, tell us more. Well, anyhow, but the point is, folks, as recently as 4 years before, those 55 people who confessed to witchcraft should have been the first ones executed. Only 2 of them ended up even being tried. Now, if the trials had continued to spin out of control for years, I suspect all those people would have died. But frankly, unfortunately, most of the people who were tried, almost all the people who were tried, pled not guilty, but still were convicted, sentenced, and executed. So that, to me, gives you the ultimate injustice, the political, moral, religious injustice that was the Salem witch trials. And I think the bottom line is that anybody who had anything to do with the witch trials, for the most part, except for those few true believers who never realized or admitted anything went wrong, most people recognize this injustice sooner or later, and the closer you were to it, if you were a victim who happened to survive or a family member of a victim who didn't survive, those people, their neighbors, their friends, even some of the people who were involved as accusers or judges, refused to let this issue die and to be forgotten. And that's why I think Salem, even though by European standards is not a large outbreak of witchcraft, that is why Salem is so well known. So I want to talk about that process of how Salem lived on and how the story continues, and frankly, what relevance it has. And I won't get too preachy about scapegoating, but some other interesting lessons from 1692. And yes, I will even work in Maine once or twice, and I'm going to end the talk talking about Pemaquid. How's that? But it's not like last year where I talked a lot about Maine. So first off, those victims that survived and their heirs filed petitions and claims to the government seeking redress of grievance, seeking for a restoration of innocency, as they termed it. Technically, what they were looking for was a reversal of attainder. When you are charged and convicted with a crime, a capital crime like witchcraft, you are under attainder. That is, your life is forfeit. And as soon as you're convicted, you are legally dead, even while you're still alive. And we actually had several people who had been convicted who weren't executed, like Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Faulkner, and they struggled for years to get their attainder reversed. 1703, the two of them and Mary Wardwell. Until that time, they were legally dead. Poor Elizabeth Proctor, her stepsons had actually closed out her husband's estate and will and probated it, and they claimed the inheritance of all the estate because she was legally dead. And she couldn't even go before a judge and complain because she had no legal standing, because legally she was dead, until 1703, when she began to try to get some redress for grievances. In 1720, there were 20 more reversals. Now, by the way, too, is a reversal of attainder is different than a pardon, right? Anybody that accepts a pardon, in accepting a pardon, you're acknowledging guilt. Reversal of attainder is not like that. It is saying, nope, you are not guilty. We erred in the decision. You no longer have that charge under you. But sometimes people use the word pardon, but what you really want is the reversal of attainder, that no, I didn't do this. I'm not dead before the law. 20 more people received the reversal in 1711. And reparations were made for the first time. Damage is paid to the victims and their families for their losses. But the process of reversals and requests for reparations continued. The last, and you see here on the right that 1711 reversal, the petitions continued until 1749 from various members of the families, without a lot of success after 1711, but it certainly stayed in people's minds. For example, one of the young legislators who heard these appeals in the 1730s and 40s was young Thomas Hutchinson, a fellow who would later be governor of Massachusetts in the 1770s, and also a historian. In 1769, he published his history, volume 2 of Massachusetts Bay, and he leads that off with over 30 pages on the Salem witch trials, talks about the injustice, talks about the fact from what a legal sham it was, how there was no way to cross-examine witnesses, and that it was against the law for lawyers to practice. They wasn't allowed for lawyers to practice for fees in Massachusetts until 1704. Now, as the son, grandson, and great-grandson of lawyers, you know, I could crack a couple lawyer jokes here, but point is, if you don't have someone standing beside you in court to cross-examine this somewhat suspect testimony that's taking place, you have a lot less chance of surviving. But this process actually continued into the 20th and 21st century. Last summer, you may have heard this in the news, the absolute last one remaining person convicted of witchcraft had the Massachusetts legislature officially reverse her attainder, Elizabeth Johnson, Jr. So a process that started in 1692 to some degrees only came to an end in 2022. And you know, I know a lot of people say, well, doesn't the legislature have better ways to waste their time? What difference does this make, you know? She's been dead since the 1740s. She never had children. She doesn't have direct descendants. But you know what? She had family. And I know from working with the descendant groups how critically important such gestures are to them. And I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So some people are really trying to heal by getting justice, restorative justice for their ancestors, right? Others take the story with them as they leave Salem. Because believe me, after 1692, over the next decade or so, there is what I call the Salem diaspora, with people leaving for all parts of New England, as you see on the map here. And the best example of this are Peter Cloyce and her second husband, Sarah Town Cloyce. Now, I will say, with her first husband, her first husband, Peter, had been a resident of Wells. So there's another Maine tie for you, Belinda. But in 1692, she and both of her sisters, Mary Easty and Rebecca Nurse, are arrested for witchcraft. They both are executed. She survives after over a year in prison. But the judge in the 1693 case, one of the judges of the new court, Massachusetts creates a whole new court system in 1693, a new superior court under the new government's charter. And the first thing they do is spend the whole spring trying cases for witchcraft. One of the judges of the Superior Court of Judicature, which is today actually the Supreme Court of Judicature, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, one of those judges is a fellow named Thomas Danforth. And one of the women whose cases he hears is none other than Sarah Cloyce. And not long after Sarah is found not guilty and released from prison. By the way, back then, being in prison was like staying at a bad bed and breakfast. You had to pay for your room and board. So not only once you're freed, and then the family has to come up with the money to pay to get you out. And one woman actually died after she was found not guilty before her poor family could scrounge up the money to come into Boston, pay her fees, and take her home. The good news was Sarah survived. And even better news was, it seems, we can't prove this because we don't have a document that says this, but it seems that Thomas Danforth took pity on the family. He had this place called Danforth Farms, this huge tract of land of several thousand acres on the south shore of Massachusetts. And he offered Peter and Sarah land there. And in fact, it will become the town of Framingham. And Sarah and Peter and about 50 members of their extended family, including children and grandchildren of her sisters who were deceased, all left the Salem area and moved to the community that's still known as the Salem End community on Salem End Road in Framingham. So the western part of Framingham, not far from Framingham State University. So for some people, the answer was get out, get away as far as possible. And they weren't the only ones. The Raymond family moved to the South Shore, to Middleborough. You know, during the war, until the war ended in 1697, there weren't that many places you could go. You didn't want to go to the frontier. And then there's another war, Queen Anne's War, that starts in 1701. So people had to be imaginative as where they went. They'd go to the South Shore. They'd go to Rhode Island. Sarah and Edward Bishop went to Rehoboth, Massachusetts. Sarah had, of course, been accused of witchcraft in 1692. The Haynes left Salem Village. That's their house up there at the top of the screen. Good news is this is not a talk that relies heavily on visuals. And if you see something's wrong with your eyes, believe me, it's not. It's the screen. And then even other people, like the Way brothers and their families, moved to South Carolina for opportunities down there. Now, again, can I prove that all these people were leaving because of the witch trials? No, but there's a real strong push then and over the next decade or two to escape from Salem Village. And folks, this is not a coincidence, okay? Now, some of these families moved far and wide over multiple generations, and including families of the judges. Very interesting. Judge Bartholomew Gedney of Salem, his granddaughter, Deborah Clark, married William Fairfax, a fellow from Virginia, when he was up he had an office for a few years, a governmental office in Massachusetts. They met, and he took her home to Virginia. And of course, Deborah's stepdaughter was married to this fellow, Lawrence Washington. And in fact, Deborah and William's son, Brian, was a boyhood friend of Lawrence's half-brother, some guy named George. So, by the way, and of course, Brian will later be the 8th Lord Fairfax, and his sister-in-law is Sally Fairfax, that girl that George Washington had a crush on as a young man, right? Well, I point this out in part, not because of people leaving, but also to point out how close the revolutionary generation was to the Salem witch trials. Think about this. There were, from 1692 to 1775 is 83 years, all right? So people at Bunker Hill would have had about as much remembrance of the Salem witch trials as we would of events 83 years ago in 1940. Now, not many of us were alive then or remember that, but I think we've all heard about the greatest generation, even if they don't talk much about themselves, through parents, through grandparents, through books. We know that story. We know the suffering, the tragedy, the triumph, right? People in New England, in Massachusetts in particular, who were descendants even, would have absolutely known the story of the Salem witch trials, right? People like Thomas, if they didn't, they would have read Thomas Hutchinson's book, which was a bestseller in the 1770s. And they would have caught on pretty quickly. And there are a lot of people of the Revolutionary era, actually, who had direct connections back to the witch trials. Nathan Hale, the Connecticut spy who, of course, was captured and regretted that he had but one life to give for his country. He's from Coventry, Connecticut, but he is the great-grandson of Reverend John and his wife, Reverend John Noyes and his wife, John Hale and his wife, Sarah Noyes of Beverly. Reverend Noyes had been one of the first people to visit the Paris household as a neighboring minister to try to figure out what was wrong with the Paris kids when they were afflicted. In the end, they decided with witchcraft. Of course, he changed his mind in the fall of 1692 when one of the last people accused of witchcraft was his own wife. And he himself would be very influential in writing a book on the Salem witch trials. He actually, we know from Samuel Sewall, the witchcraft judge and diarist, that several years after the trials, Hale talked to his friend Sewall and said, I really need to write a book on the trials and set the record straight. And Sewall encouraged him to do so. So he did. He wrote a book before he died in 1697, and he pretty much laid out the truth and assessed a fair amount of blame for Massachusetts. Essentially, though, what he says is, well, we wandered in the clouds and lost our way, and we were deluded by Satan. That's about as close to guilt as you could get back then. But he did that. But he was so worried about publishing this book. And Hale was one of the most popular, most beloved ministers in Massachusetts. You know what he did? He gave the manuscript to his son and said, after I die, why don't you publish this? So that's how explosive an issue this was, that even a beloved minister couldn't come out and take a relatively neutral stance and say, we were deluded by Satan. No, there weren't real witches here. He felt that would have gotten him in too much trouble. So anyhow, the legacy shows up in the witch trials in strange places, like in Nathan Hale. And I'm probably the only person who's written a book on the Salem witch trials that features the very famous painting, Death of General General Warren at Bunker Hill by Trumbull, which of course you can go see the original. It's much larger than the screen, I assure you, down at the MFA in Boston. It's a brilliant monumental painting. And in that painting, if you look on the screen on the left, is General Israel Putnam of Pomfret, Connecticut, who was born where? He and his wife both were born in Salem Village, two families that were deeply involved in the witch trials. And as a young married couple, they left for life on their own in Connecticut. Or in the middle of the picture itself, you can see the dying figure of General Warren. And he's, of course, the great-grandson of Robert Califf, who writes his own history of the witch trials in 1700 that's incredibly critical of the Massachusetts government. And then Peter Salem to the right, an enslaved African who spent some time in slavery in Salem, and when he was freed, he took the last name Salem. As I say, strange where this stuff shows up. But all these people on this battlefield, I think, to be pretty sure, at least the Americans, knew a lot about the Salem witch trials. So, one of the lasting themes to me is, we'll tie this back into the end too. This revolutionary generation understood this and knew the importance of rights. It's what they were fighting for. And there really are some interesting connections between the witch trials and the evolution of legal rights. And at the end of the talk, I'll talk about the Bill of Rights itself. But consider this. In October 1692, as I mentioned, Governor Phipps issues the publication ban. He didn't want to hear any more books on the witch trials. Cotton Mather, basically an apologist for the governor, had published a book, and as soon as it was published, Phipps sent it to England and said to the king and the queen, see, here you go. Only witches were executed, no innocent lives were lost, and you got the truth because Cotton Mather is the brilliant Puritan minister from Boston. Kid graduated from Harvard at 16, pretty sharp. So you don't need to hear it. We've got the truth here. We don't really need anyone else to tell the story, do we? No, I don't think so. Publication ban. Well, guess what? 3 years later, Thomas More, one of those troublesome Quakers from Salem, broke the publication ban. He complained bitterly about the injustices of Massachusetts, by the way, including executing those 4 innocent Quakers just for trying to proselytize their faith back in the late 1650s, early 1660s. The way the Puritans had persecuted people as witches, etc., etc. And he published this long book about it. There you see a copy of it, Truth Held Forth and Maintained, that he had the temerity to publish under his own name. Had it published in New York. That was the smart move. And in the end, he's found not guilty by a Puritan court, presided over by one of the judges, Samuel Sewall, who presided over 1692 as well. But he's found not guilty of seditious libel. Ultimately, in court, Maul argued, he said, well, how do you know that I wrote this book? Look, book with your name on it? How do you know that someone didn't just put my name on it to get me into trouble? He said, it seems a bit like spectral evidence to me. Whoa. Not guilty. Not guilty. And again, does anyone cite this in the Bill of Rights? Not that I found so far. But many legal scholars see this as the beginnings of the First Amendment. The right of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. This is that first court case where someone had really had the odds stacked against them in a Puritan court. By the way, including one of the jurors had convicted witches in 1692 as well. Not guilty. In 1705, Massachusetts takes a really interesting step. They begin for the first time to allow lawyers to practice for fees. They're really the beginnings of the paid legal profession in Massachusetts. Again, does anyone say, hey, because of the, people didn't want to talk about the witch trials, but it's clear this was an influence in this. How do you know that? Well, isn't it interesting? Usually the colonies follow distantly behind legal changes and things like that in England. Guess what? England does not allow lawyers to practice for fee as defense counsel until 1836, except in cases of treason, the one exception which they passed earlier. So in other words, people in Massachusetts understood the importance of having a legal defense and did something about it over 100 years before the British did. And again, I don't think that's a coincidence that it first happened in Massachusetts like a dozen years after the witch trials. Right? So there were legal steps, I think, that people took to try to redress some of the wrongs of Salem in several different ways. But think what it would have been like to be living in Salem Village in 1693. And you're sitting there on what used to be the best day of the week, the Lord's Day, the day of rest, the day that you could devote to God and family and community, where all the community comes together to worship all day long. Puritan worship service lasted, you'd be in there for 3 or 4 hours in the morning, then break for lunch, then be back for another 4 hours in the afternoon. It was a full day. That's what people loved, right? That community, the spirituality, the prayer. Imagine what that's like in 1693, when you're sitting on the same pew with another family who may have been responsible for accusing and convicting your mother, your loved one, of witchcraft. How do you face those people? How do you face your neighbors? Think of the suffering, the pain, the embarrassment felt by the community. Takes a long time to heal from that, right? And in fact, in working on Storm of Witchcraft, the last couple chapters of Storm of Witchcraft are kind of the introduction to these themes that are going to be in the new book. In Storm of Witchcraft, I give an example of this how the marriage patterns in Salem and surrounding towns were affected by the witch trials. If you're victims of the Salem witch trials and you've lost a loved one, you're kind of shunned by some elements of society. And they don't get you. So who do your children end up marrying? They marry into the families of other victims. Right? And it takes a long time for those to even consider marrying that cute boy next door because his family, no, it's not happening. Right? Over 100 years later, there were still going on these things that I call healing marriages, where you have different branches of different sides of families on different sides of the witch trials finally marrying. And, I'm sure these were marriages of love, but also you can see some of these are deeply symbolic and really help to heal ancient breaches between families. And the classic example of this is the Barker family. The Barkers moved to this new town on the main frontier of Bethel. in the 1780s. And then actually, within a couple of years, some of the members moved all the way up to Sunday River. No, there was no skiing up there then. You are in the most remote settlement in Massachusetts Bay. Now, the brothers had been born in Methuen, but the family had originated in nearby Andover and had been very much involved in the witch trials. Their great-grandfather, William Barker, had confessed to witchcraft in 1692 and has been one of those notorious confessor-accusers. After he confessed to witchcraft, probably with a little prodding from the court, and frankly, they weren't beyond a little judicial torture, he started saying all of his friends and neighbors who were witches, that he'd seen them. Matter of fact, he accused Abigail Faulkner of witchcraft. And Abigail's sister, actually, when she confesses, says she rode to meeting with William Barker on a broomstick. Yeah. And again, they knew this. And if you didn't believe me, listen to this story, right? So, in 1788, Jonathan marries his sweetheart, Nancy Swan, another resident of Sunday River, another family from Andover. Matter of fact, you're looking at the gravestone of her great-uncle, Timothy Swan, who died in February 1693. Timothy was afflicted in 1692 in Salem, probably died of whatever those afflictions were. I don't think they were witchcraft, but he clearly was seriously ill. And in fact, his afflictions led to 16 people being accused of witchcraft in the Salem witch trials. And you can see Timothy's gravestone in the North Andover Cemetery, which is one of the most amazing 17th century cemeteries anywhere in Massachusetts. So again, we have two Andover families, descendants who decide to marry. And particularly, well, maybe it wasn't different than today, but they finally decide it's time to get married when Nancy's 3 months pregnant. Now, to some degrees, this happened a lot back then, because most fathers back then, it's kind of like, look, I know you're sweet on that guy, but I could use your help with the field. So, well, you come pregnant, that kind of forces the issue, doesn't it? Guess we're getting married. But what's interesting is Jonathan and Nancy being way up at Sunday River, which is a long ways from here, let alone from Methuen, where the family was from. They decide, with Nancy 3 months pregnant, to drive, to go all the way back to Massachusetts for the ceremony. By canoe, by walking, by boat, by some more canoes and walking. That's a long ways, folks. That's a long drive today, for gosh sakes, right? Imagine doing that through the wilderness with a woman who's 3 months pregnant. This is dangerous stuff. Why are you doing this? Well, you're going to Methuen to get married before the rest of the family, right? No! You go 25 miles beyond Methuen all the way to Acton, out near Concord, right? Just beyond the Concord Rotary there on Route 2. You don't know anybody. You have no family in Acton. Why on earth do these people with ties to the Salem witch trials go to Acton to marry? To heal an old wound. They're married by Colonel Francis Faulkner. He's the local justice of the peace. He's the son of Ami Ruhama Faulkner, which Ami Ruhama is Hebrew for my people have been shown great mercy. What on earth is that about? Well, Abigail Faulkner, when she had been accused of witchcraft and caught up with the Barker families and others, she was convicted and sentenced to death, but she was pregnant at the time. Isn't it interesting that over 100 years later, a woman who's 3 months pregnant comes before Abigail's grandson, in fact, the son of Ami Ruhama, the son that saved Abigail's life. They go to her, or should they go to him to marry them? And interesting again, the testimony of Abigail's sister, Elizabeth Johnson. She had accused Barker. She said she was carried there upon a pole, and that her sister Faulkner was there, and William Barker and others. She knew not. To me, this is clear evidence. No one wrote this down in the diary, but it's pretty clear to me what's going on here, right? This is sort of a healing for all three families taking place there. There are dozens of other towns I could talk to. I could talk about Salem, Canada, present-day Wilton and Lynborougugh, New Hampshire, settled by people moving out from Salem in the 1730s. granted to the veterans who lived in Salem, Massachusetts, who were veterans of Phipps invasion of Canada in 1690. It's an amazing little town today. And if you look at all of the proprietors, that is the men who were awarded the township of New Salem, another new town in the 1730s, almost all of these folks are from Salem, Peabody, and Danvers. Salem in the 17th century made up all of these towns, right? In the 1680s, Salem consisted of what is now Salem and Peabody and Danvers and parts of Middleton. But it was people from these towns who were granted all of these new towns throughout New England. And there's Salem Village right in the middle. Another New Salem proprietor, Amos Putnam. The Putnam family were some of the leading accusers. And in fact, his father, John Putnam, was constable in Salem Village in 1692. His job was to escort the accused to trial. He marries Lydia Trask, who was the daughter of another proprietor, John Trask. The Trasks were Salem Village people who were very much involved in the witch trials. And in fact, John Putnam and his brother Edward signed the arrest complaint that leads to Rebecca Nurse's arrest and ultimate death. Down the street in Salem Village lived the Holton family. Another proprietor was Benjamin Holton, spelled H-O-L-T-E-N or O-N. But guess what, folks? One of those Holtons leaves New Salem to get as far away from Salem and Massachusetts as possible and still physically be in New England. Yes, Holton becomes Holton, H-O-U-L-T-O-N, and he is one of the two founders of Holton, Maine. The other founder is a Putnam, so from New Salem. Aaron Putnam's wife is another Trask, another Lydia Trask, right? See all of these families moving out of Salem, taking the story with them. Another proprietor, New Salem, Thorndike Proctor. He never lives there, but you know his grandfather. His grandfather was John Proctor, one of the victims of the Salem witch trials. And in fact, Thorndike will inherit Proctor's Ledge, property of the families. He was born 6 years after the witch trials, but I'm sure Thorndike knew that Proctor's Ledge was where his grandfather had been executed in 1692. And in fact, I could talk at length. I'll keep it short because it's hot. But Gallows Hill is a really interesting story because the execution site at Proctor's Ledge has been lost at least twice, right? John Adams in 1766 visits Witchcraft Hill. He knows where the site is. But by Hawthorne's time in 1835, when he writes Alice Stone's Appeal, he's going, it's at the top of the hill where they were executed, and it's no longer Witchcraft Hill, it's now become Gallows Hill. We have no evidence. We've done the work. There's no evidence there was actually a gallows. What happens is, this is an example of collective amnesia. Salem did its best to forget the location of the execution site so they could forget the witch trials. They kept on trying to make memorials. In 1892, 200 years afterwards, they wanted to build a lookout tower, a memorial at the top of Gallows Hill. People weren't willing to fund it. They wouldn't subscribe. No one wanted a memorial. It was still, 200 years later, it was still too close to too many people. Still too hurtful. Still too much shame. Finally, in the early 20th century, Sidney Purley, a local historian, wrote a couple of articles, 1901, 1921, that mapped out exactly where, from all the evidence, where the executions took place on Proctor's Ledge, which is between Pope and Proctor Street, right off of Boston Street in Salem, right behind the Walgreens. Of course, the Walgreens, their slogan is the corner of happy and healthy. They weren't too happy or healthy to hear that they had a mass execution in their backyard. But in fact, in 2000, they finally built a memorial in Salem in 1992, but it was in town. It's a beautiful memorial, but it's not at the execution site. So finally in 2010, I was part of a team that went over the evidence to see if we could confirm once and for all where the execution site was. And we all agreed finally on it, and we used the evidence that Purley had, but also found a document where, particularly there was one woman, Rebecca Eames, who was brought into Salem from Boxford for questioning under charges of witchcraft on August 19, 1692, the date of the third set of executions. And the judges questioned her later that day, and my friend Marilyn Roach was the first to find and pay attention to the transcript of that questioning. One of the questions the judges asked, I think probably to intimidate her, like, well, you came into town today. To come into town, you had to go right by Gallows Hill. Did you see the executions? You know, in other words, tell the truth or this could happen to you. And she said, yes, she watched them from the house below the hill. We knew the road, we knew the houses that were there, and we sort of have the superimposed map of 1692. Those blue dots are where the houses are on Boston Street. And from there, this is a view shed analysis showing what you could see. And you can't see that red area, which is the top of Gallows Hill where the water tower is today. So the executions could not have taken place at the top. They took down much lower in that green square to the left of the screen here. And that's Proctor's Ledge. That's the land, that's where the executions took place. And now having said this, it being Salem, we couldn't announce it at that point. We first had to have my friend Peter Sablock do geophysical remote sensing. That is using ground penetrating radar to look for any evidence of bodies. Because people in Salem would want to know, well, where are they buried? Well, the good news is it was called Proctor's Ledge for a reason. There's only about a foot of soil over most of that site, no more than a foot and a half of the deepest parts. The soil is completely perturbated and all by the actions of 300 years or thousands of years, frankly, of earthworms. So no evidence of any bodies there. And so in fact, you can see here some of our lines showing almost, bedrock almost immediately. So on the 325th anniversary of the first executions on July 19th, 2017, we were there to dedicate a memorial at Proctor's Ledge. We didn't find, it's funny because it was named one of the top 10 archaeological discoveries of 2016. And people say, Tad, wow, that must have been like the crowning achievement of your archaeological career. I'm going like, well, not really, because we didn't find anything, really. We confirmed Pearlie's work, yeah, and that was important. Our job, though, was to make sure that the site was never, ever, ever forgotten for like the third or fourth time. Right? Well, it's getting hot, so I'm gonna conclude. And we're actually working on a documentary on the Salem witch trials on the aftermath with my friends from the Gallows Hill team. And we were sort of pushed about, well, why is this important from the folks, because we're writing a grant, so we have to sort of say why it's important. And I started doing some research, and I think it's fair to say, again, I do not have any speeches saying, because of the witch trials, we need a Bill of Rights. But yeah, basically, folks, we have a Bill of Rights, I think, because of the Salem witch trials, in part, okay? That one great injustice, that massive failure of a government to protect innocent lives. And so I started to try to connect those dots. And to me, it's really clear we have a Bill of Rights thanks to this guy named Elbridge Gerry, right? Elbridge Gerry is one of the founding fathers who doesn't get much love. Maybe because he was a sort of crotchety, contrarian kind of guy. Smart, Harvard-educated lawyer, part of the gang, less reasonable than his buddies Hancock and the Adams boys, because particularly, he signed the Declaration of Independence. He attended the Constitutional Convention. He went there saying, we need something stronger than the Articles of Confederation. He says, basically, if we don't agree to something, we're going to be picked apart by our enemies, and that'll be the end of us. So yeah, we need a stronger central government. But he also was a little skeptical about giving too much power to the government. Again, that fear that we all kind of have, right? In particular, too, throughout the Constitutional Convention, he spoke like the second most times, I think, to maybe like Madison, of anybody at the Constitutional Convention. He kept saying, we're giving away a lot of power here. Where are our rights? Elbridge, don't worry about it, it's implied. Yeah, we all know what happens about implied rights, right? Yeah. He was really skeptical. So in fact, even though he knew we needed a stronger government, he actually refused to sign the new Constitution and to vote to send it out for ratification, right? Well, so what? Well, about 6 months later, they have the ratifying conventions, right? And we know the Constitution, remember, people went to Philadelphia not to create a Constitution and a new government, to see if we could just tinker with the Articles of Confederation, So this was like, you're doing what? Well, the good news was the first 5 states that had conventions, you needed 2/3 of the states to approve ratify the new Constitution to put into effect. And frankly, you need all 13 to agree. I mean, so imagine some state like Pennsylvania in the middle says, no. Really? What are you going to do? So you really need unanimous consent. And the first 5 states it skates through. Then number 6, Massachusetts. Massachusetts is pretty evenly divided as to whether they should pass this thing or not. And Massachusetts was a big, important state then, and if Massachusetts doesn't vote for the Constitution, it is sunk, even if you get the other states to agree, right? Who leads the opposition to the Massachusetts Convention to ratification? Elbridge Gerry. No, no, no. Too much power, not enough rights. By the way, Gerry was a great compromiser. We all know of the great compromise in the Constitutional Convention, right? The small states, we want a Senate where every state's treated equal. The big states like Massachusetts, we want direct representation. We want the House where the big states have more votes, more voice, because we're bigger economies, more people, right? Elbridge Gerry was the guy who forged the great compromise, right? House and Senate, division of powers. Elbridge Gerry helped broker a deal to get the convention approved by Massachusetts in the new Constitution. He said, okay, I'll go along with this as long as we agree right here and now that we're demanding a Bill of Rights. When Congress first meets, the first thing they take up is approving these Bill of 12 rights. Well, we only approved 10. There were other 2 that had to do with like electors and voting that weren't critical as the others were. So here we go. Elbridge Gerry, to my mind, in Massachusetts, the skeptical guy from Massachusetts, the skeptical Harvard-trained lawyer who would have certainly read Hutchinson's history. Probably talked about it with his folks, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson in his library had a copy of Hutchinson's history. Other folks did too. Look at the First Amendment, those rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, right? You know, rights to freedom of assembly. Look at the Sixth Amendment, a compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in your favor and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Again, the British won't do this for 50 more years. Thanks to folks like Elbridge Gerry and others, we have a Bill of Rights. Did I mention Elbridge Gerry was born and raised and lived all of his life, except one, by the way, when he was in Washington or Philadelphia, and he was the 5th Vice President of the United States, died in office as Madison's 2nd Vice President. How have we not heard about this guy, right? Well, oh, right, we have gerrymandering. He's the guy responsible for gerrymandering in Massachusetts, in the Essex County district where he lived. The gerrymander, the beast, one town wide, except for the wing. Yeah, look it up. So Elbridge Gerry was a Marbleheader who lived most of his life under the shadow within 5 miles of Gallows Hill, right? And I said I did with Pemaquid. If that name Elbridge sounds familiar to you folks? Yes. He is the great-grandson and namesake of Thomas Elbridge, who was the owner of the Pemaquid patent, a very prosperous Bristol, England family. And Thomas's father and grandparents, I think actually great-uncle, had owned the Pemaquid patent. And apparently there was a family legacy, I think, to his mother from an estate in England or something. So he was named in honor of the Elbridges of Bristol and the Pemaquid patent. So I could talk much longer, but you're all melting. I am too. I do have some books for sale. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Do you want to take questions?
I'm happy to take questions, but I also understand if people want to get up and get the heck out of here, you're welcome to. I won't be. In September, I start teaching my 30th year at Salem State. And the town is still very much conflicted. You know, Salem's largest economy today is tourism, basically on the Salem witch trials. In the month of October alone, we'll have 1 million people there for haunted happenings. Some people, you know, as a post-industrial city that used to be famous for its Sylvania light bulb factory and also Parker Brothers games, it's a post-industrial economy. Salem has an amazing history, so heritage tourism makes sense, right? On the other hand, the fact that we're basically making most of that money on the witch trials not on Salem's other amazing history, not on the Peabody Essex Museum. Did you know that the first historic park in the National Park Service system is Salem? Amazing history, amazing first. Nathaniel Bowditch, the practical navigator, you name it, right? Anyhow, I could go on. But the point is, they come to Salem for witchcraft tourism. That's where we make most of our money. Basically, the fact that we had 25 people die in the witch trials. People, most of them, again, died. Why? Because they refused to confess and play the game. Really? So it's still very much of an issue in Salem to this day. I will say, though, I was, when we announced the finding in 2015 to the mayor, Kim Driscoll, who, by the way, is now Deputy Governor of Massachusetts, or Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, we didn't know what she'd say. You know, I was thinking, like, a bunch of historians are going to have to raise a lot of money for a memorial. And she said, no, the town needs to do this. First, good news was the town already owned the land. But this is a way that the town can help to heal, I think she felt, and we all felt. And I'd like to hope that it's kind of a first step in that healing process. And I spoke at the dedication of Gallows Hill and of Proctor's Ledge Memorial at Gallows Hill. And I said, I'd like to see a little more serious reflection on the events of 1692 and their meaning year-round, and a little less celebration in October for haunted happenings. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Since you're writing another book,
Yep.
what will its date be, and when can we expect?
So I'm still playing with that. It really is a sequel to Storm of Witchcraft. So I'm thinking maybe something like Wake of the Storm may be in there somewhere, but but it's really going to be on, and maybe the subtitle of Loss and Healing in Salem from 1692 to present, or something like that. Yeah, it'll be another 2 or 3 years. It's coming. It's coming, but I'm actually trying to write 2 other books, including an archaeology book and a couple other things. And I'm still teaching at Salem State, so be patient, but you got one of the first glimpses of that book. Any other questions? But you kind of got most of the thumbnails of the pieces of what you're going to see in that. Anything else? All right. Thanks, folks.